Montana Territory, 1887. The wind whipped through the lone ponderosa pines dotting the valley as the setting sun painted the Bitterroot Mountains in shades of amber and gold. In a land where men outnumbered women 20-1, and where the harsh reality of frontier life had hardened even the kindest souls, Frederick Freddie Sullivan had convinced himself that loneliness was simply the price a cowboy paid for freedom. At 26, Freddie had already lived more lifetimes than most men twice his age. Lean and muscular from years of breaking horses and driving cattle, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had made peace with solitude. His sandy brown hair fell in waves beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and his clean-shaven face revealed a strong jawline that only softened when he offered his rare smile. Though the other hands at the Rocking M Ranch often rode into town seeking companionship in the saloons and dance halls, Freddie kept to himself, believing that attachments only led to heartbreak on the frontier. No sense in dreaming of things that cannot last, he often told himself as he stared into campfire flames during long cattle drives. The West takes more than it gives. This belief had been cemented 3 years prior, when he watched his best friend die slowly from a gunshot wound after a cattle rustling gone wrong. In the days it took William to succumb to infection, delirious with fever, he had called out for a sweetheart back east who would never know his fate. Freddie had vowed then that he would never put someone through such pain. The frontier was no place for love stories, only survival tales. So Freddie worked harder than any man at the Rocking M, taking the most dangerous assignments, volunteering for the longest watches, and speaking only when necessary. The other hands respected his skills, but kept their distance from his brooding silence. His boss, Martin McCready, valued his work ethic, but worried about the emptiness he saw behind the young man's eyes. "Boy's got the look of someone who's already given up," McCready had commented to his wife one evening. "And he ain't even reached 30. What Freddie truly wanted was simple: enough money saved to buy his own small parcel of land where he could raise horses in peace, answering to no one but himself and the changing seasons. What he failed to recognize was his desperate need for human connection, something more meaningful than brief exchanges with weathered cowboys and storekeepers. This carefully constructed solitude might have continued indefinitely if not for the events that began on a crisp September morning in 1887, when Martin McCready announced to his hands that his niece would be arriving from Philadelphia the following week to teach at the newly established schoolhouse in town. "Frances Harper is a fine young woman," McCready told his men during breakfast. 22 years old and educated back east, my sister's daughter. Her father passed this spring, God rest his soul, and she's decided to make a new start out west. I expect every one of you to be on your best behavior when she arrives." Freddie barely glanced up from his plate. Another Easterner who would either flee back home after the first winter or marry the first man who offered security. It was none of his concern, but fate had other plans. The stagecoach arrived during one of Montana's temperamental autumn afternoons, when sunshine gave way to threatening clouds within minutes. Freddie happened to be in town purchasing supplies when the coach rolled in, dust billowing behind its wheels. He paid it little mind until a commotion caught his attention. The stagecoach had barely stopped when the skies opened. As passengers hurried to collect their belongings, a young woman descended the steps, struggling with a large trunk. The driver, more concerned with the mail delivery than his passengers, had already moved away. Before Freddie could think better of it, he found himself crossing the muddy street. "Allow me, miss," he said, tipping his hat as raindrops began to fall more heavily. The woman looked up, and Freddie felt something shift in his chest. Framed by honey-blonde hair escaping a practical traveling bonnet, her face held a quiet determination that contrasted with her obvious exhaustion. Her eyes, the clear blue of mountain lakes, widened slightly at his approach. "Thank you, sir. I would be most grateful," she replied, her Eastern accent softening the edges of her words. As Freddie lifted the trunk with ease, she gathered her skirts, practical navy blue wool for traveling, and attempted to shield her reticule from the rapidly intensifying downpour. "You must be Miss Harper," Freddie said, surprised at his own initiative in conversation. "Mr. McCready mentioned you'd be arriving today." "Yes, I am Frances Harper, and you are?" "Frederick Sullivan. I work at your uncle's ranch." A crack of thunder made her jump slightly, and Freddie noticed how she straightened immediately afterward, as if embarrassed by the display of vulnerability. "Is my uncle here to meet me?" she asked, scanning the nearly empty street. I believe he planned to, but this storm likely delayed him. The creek sometimes floods the lower road during heavy rains. As if to punctuate his words, the rain began falling in sheets. Without thinking, Freddie set down the trunk under the overhang of the general store and removed his coat, holding it over her head. "Oh, you needn't," she began. "Please, miss. You'll catch your death." Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgment, perhaps, of the unexpected kindness that could still be found in this harsh land. Frances accepted his gesture with a small nod. "Mr. Sullivan, might I impose upon you to direct me to somewhere I might wait for my uncle? I fear standing in the doorway of a store with my trunk might not be the most suitable arrangement." Freddie hesitated, weighing proprieties against practicality. "The hotel dining room would be most appropriate, Miss Harper. I could escort you there until your uncle arrives." The relief in her expression was evident. That would be most appreciated. As they walked the short distance to Montana House, the rain pounding on the boardwalk around them, Freddie maintained a respectful distance while keeping his coat extended over her. Once inside, he arranged for her trunk to be placed near the entrance and secured a small table in the corner of the dining room. "Would you care for some coffee, Miss Harper? To warm you after your journey?" Frances removed her bonnet, revealing the full glory of her honey-blonde hair, neatly pinned but with rebellious tendrils framing her face. The journey had clearly taken its toll, yet there was a vitality to her that seemed at odds with her proper Eastern attire. "Yes, that would be lovely," she replied, then added with unexpected frankness, "though I must confess, after 3 days on that stagecoach, I would trade all the coffee in Montana for a proper bath." The comment, so honest and unguarded, surprised a genuine laugh from Freddie, a sound he had almost forgotten. Frances smiled in response, a dimple appearing in her right cheek, and for a moment the years of self-imposed isolation fell away from him. Over steaming cups of coffee, Frances spoke of her journey west, describing the changing landscapes with an artist's eye and the various characters she had encountered with gentle humor. Freddie found himself entranced not just by her beauty, though that was undeniable, but by her perspective on things he had long taken for granted. "And what of you, Mr. Sullivan? Have you always lived in Montana territory?" she asked. The question brought him back to reality. "No, miss, I came west from Missouri when I was 17, been working cattle most of my life." "And your family?" Freddie stiffened slightly. "Gone now." "It's just me." He expected pity in her eyes, the reason he rarely shared even this much, but instead found something different, recognition. "I understand loneliness, Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly. "My mother died when I was 14, and my father and I were companions more than family afterward. When he passed this spring, I realized I had been living in a house of memories rather than making my own life." Before Freddie could respond, the dining room door burst open, and Martin McCready entered, dripping rainwater onto the polished floors. "Frances, thank the Lord you're safe. When I couldn't make it to meet the stage, I feared you'd be stranded," McCready exclaimed, embracing his niece as she stood to greet him. "I was fortunate to encounter Mr. Sullivan, who has been most kind," Frances replied, gesturing toward Freddie, who had risen respectfully. McCready looked between them with evident surprise. "Freddie, well, I'll be. Didn't expect you to be the socializing type." Freddie felt his cheeks warm. "Just happened to be in town for supplies when the stage arrived, sir." "Well, I'm grateful. Frances, are you ready to head out to the ranch? Martha's been cooking since dawn in anticipation of your arrival." As Frances gathered her belongings, she turned to Freddie. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Sullivan. I hope our paths cross again." "I expect they will, miss. I work for your uncle, after all." Something in her smile suggested she had more to say, but with a final nod, she departed with McCready, leaving Freddie standing alone in the dining room, his coffee growing cold, and the strange sensation that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered world. The following weeks brought an unfamiliar disruption to Freddie's routine. Though he tried to maintain his usual distance, he found himself volunteering for errands to town with unusual frequency. Each time Frances visited her uncle's ranch, he discovered reasons to be near the main house, mending a fence that had stood broken for months, checking horses in the corral visible from the kitchen window, offering to drive her to town when she needed supplies for her schoolroom. Frances, for her part, seemed to see through his pretenses but never called attention to them. Instead, she engaged him in conversation whenever the opportunity arose, drawing him out with questions about ranch life, his knowledge of horses, and the surrounding countryside. "You have a way with words, Mr. Sullivan, when you choose to use them," she remarked one afternoon as he explained the different temperaments of the horses in MacCready's remuda. "Not much call for talking to horses," he replied with the ghost of a smile. "They prefer actions to words." "And people, what do they prefer?" The question caught him off guard. "Depends on the person, I suppose." Frances studied him with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to reveal. "And what about you?" Freddie busied himself adjusting a saddle strap. "Never gave it much thought." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He had thought of little else since their first meeting, about how her voice seemed to linger in his mind long after their conversations ended, about how her presence at the ranch brought color to days that had previously blended together in shades of dust and duty. The first real test of Freddie's resolute solitude came with the harvest dance in October. Such gatherings were rare opportunities for the scattered population to come together, and MacCready insisted all his hands attend. "Need to show those folks from the Sweetwater outfit we know how to clean up," he declared, "and the ladies need dancing partners. Not right for them to come all this way and stand against the wall all night." Freddie had avoided such events for years, but found himself standing before the cracked mirror in the bunkhouse that Saturday evening, attempting to tame his hair and adjust a borrowed tie that felt like a noose around his neck. "Looking mighty fine there, Sullivan," teased Thomas, one of the younger hands. "Got someone special you're hoping to impress?" Freddie scowled, just following orders. The community hall had been transformed with paper lanterns and autumn decorations. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while a small group of musicians tuned their instruments in the corner. Freddie positioned himself against the far wall, nursing a cup of punch and watching families reunite, couples promenade, and children dart between groups of adults. He spotted Frances immediately. Her dress, a deep green that brought out the gold in her hair, was simpler than the elaborate Eastern fashions some of the women wore, but she carried herself with a natural grace that drew attention. Several men had already approached her, but she seemed to be politely deflecting their advances. When her gaze finally found him across the room, the smile that illuminated her face nearly stopped his heart. Before he could retreat further into the shadows, she was making her way toward him, weaving between dancing couples. "Mr. Sullivan, you clean up remarkably well," she said, her eyes taking in his uncomfortable formal attire. "As do you, Miss Harper, green suits you." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Thank you. Are you enjoying the festivities?" Freddie glanced around at the crowded room. Not much for crowds. "Nor dancing. I wouldn't know. Haven't tried it in years." Frances tilted her head, considering him. Perhaps it's time to remedy that. The musicians began a new tune, slower than the previous ones. Frances extended her hand slightly, not quite offering it but making her invitation clear. "I would likely step on your toes, Miss Harper," Freddie protested weakly. "I have surprisingly sturdy feet, Mr. Sullivan." A necessary attribute for a schoolteacher who stands all day. Something in her gentle teasing broke through his resistance. With a deep breath, Freddie set down his punch cup and offered his arm. "Then I would be honored, Miss Harper." As they took their place among the other couples, Freddie felt conspicuously out of place. His hands were calloused from years of rope and reins, his movements stiff compared to the easy grace of the other men. But Frances guided him subtly, her hand light but sure in his, her eyes never leaving his face. "Relax, Mr. Sullivan," she murmured. "Dancing is just conversation without words." Gradually he found the rhythm, and as they moved together across the floor, the room around them seemed to fade away. For those few minutes there was only the music, the warmth of her hand in his, and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of happiness bubbling up inside him. "See, your feet remember what your mind has forgotten," Frances said, as the music drew to a close. Before Freddie could respond, a commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. 3 men entered, their trail-worn appearance and the guns holstered prominently at their sides creating an immediate shift in the room's atmosphere. "Trouble?" Freddie muttered, instinctively moving to place himself between Frances and the newcomers. The tallest of the 3 men surveyed the room with cold eyes until his gaze settled on MacCready. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. Martin McCready, he called out, his voice cutting through the suddenly quiet room. Heard you were throwing a party. Thought we'd join in. McCready stepped forward, his expression guarded. Jasper Reeves, didn't know you were back in these parts. Just passing through. Thought I'd pay my respects to the man who testified against my brother. The tension in the room was palpable. Freddie knew the story. McCready had witnessed Reeves' brother robbing the general store 2 years ago and had testified at the trial that sent him to territorial prison. That business is done, Reeves, McCready said firmly. This is a community gathering. You're welcome to stay if you mind your manners. Reeves' eyes scanned the room again, this time lingering on Frances. Quite a gathering indeed. Some new faces, too. Freddie felt Frances stiffen beside him, and something protective and fierce rose in his chest. Miss Harper, he said quietly, perhaps you should join your aunt by the refreshment table. Frances glanced up at him, clearly reading the concern in his expression. Is there going to be trouble? Not if I can help it. After ensuring Frances was safely with her aunt, Freddie made his way to stand near McCready, joined by several other ranch hands who had recognized the potential for violence. Reeves and his companions eventually moved to the far side of the room, but their presence cast a shadow over the previously festive atmosphere. The dancing continued, though with subdued energy, and many families with children made early departures. Who are those men? Frances asked when Freddie returned to check on her. Jasper Reeves and his gang. They've caused trouble up and down the territory. Your uncle helped put Reeves' brother behind bars a while back. Frances glanced toward the men, who were now helping themselves liberally to the whiskey someone had brought. They look dangerous. They are, Freddie confirmed. Best to keep your distance. As the evening wore on, Reeves and his men became increasingly intoxicated and belligerent. When they began harassing some of the younger women, Sheriff Donovan finally intervened. Think it's time you boys moved along, the sheriff said firmly. Reeves stood, swaying slightly. We ain't done nothing wrong. And I'd like to keep it that way. Town's got a nice hotel. Suggest you make use of it. For a tense moment, it seemed Reeves might challenge the sheriff's authority, but finally, with a contemptuous laugh, he signaled to his companions. As they moved toward the door, Reeves paused near Frances. Mighty pretty schoolteacher, he slurred. Might have to further my education before leaving town. Freddie stepped forward, his eyes cold. Move along, Reeves. Reeves sized him up, noting the hard set of Freddie's jaw and the steady gaze that promised consequences. With a mocking tip of his hat, Reeves followed his companions out. I should escort you and your aunt back to the ranch, Freddie told Frances once the men had gone. Is that necessary? Men like Reeves don't make idle threats. The ride back to the ranch was tense, with Freddie constantly scanning the darkness beyond the wagon. When they arrived, McCready asked him to stay the night as an extra precaution. You can use the spare room in the bunkhouse. I don't trust those men. Freddie nodded, though he knew he wouldn't sleep. Instead, he stationed himself on the porch of the main house, rifle across his knees, watching the road. Around midnight, the door opened softly behind him, and Frances emerged, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill. You should be inside, Freddie said, though there was no rebuke in his tone. I saw the light of your cigarette from my window, she replied, settling beside him on the porch step. Have there been any signs of them? No. They're probably sleeping off the whiskey in town. Frances was quiet for a moment, then said, Thank you for standing up for me earlier. Freddie shrugged uncomfortably. Any man would have done the same. That's not true, and you know it. She turned to look at him directly. You protect people, Mr. Sullivan. It's in your nature, though you try to hide it behind your solitude. Her insight unsettled him. Out here, Miss Harper, people learn to look after themselves. And yet you've been looking after me since the moment I arrived. The night air seemed suddenly charged with unspoken things. Frances was close enough that he could smell the faint lavender of her soap, could see the moonlight silvering the edges of her hair. I should see you safely inside, Freddie said, his voice rougher than intended. Frances stood, but instead of moving toward the door, she placed her hand gently on his sleeve. Mr. Sullivan, Freddie, would you tell me something honestly? The sound of his given name on her lips sent an unexpected warmth through him. If I can. Why do you isolate yourself so thoroughly from others? I've seen how the other men respect you, how my uncle values your counsel, yet you hold yourself apart." The directness of her question left no room for evasion. Freddie looked out into the darkness, gathering words he had never spoken aloud. "The West takes people, Miss Harper. It takes them suddenly and without mercy. I've seen too many good men die hard deaths, leaving behind those who loved them to face the frontier alone." He paused, the memory of William's final days sharp in his mind. It seemed easier not to form those bonds in the first place. Frances was silent for so long that Freddie finally looked at her. The compassion in her eyes held no pity, only understanding. "My father used to say that grief is the price we pay for love," she said softly, "but he also said it was a price worth paying." Before Freddie could respond, a distant sound caught his attention, horses approaching at speed. In one fluid motion he stood, positioning himself between Frances and the darkness. "Get inside, now." To her credit, Frances didn't question him. As she slipped through the door, Freddie moved to the edge of the porch, rifle ready. Within moments, riders appeared in the yard, but it wasn't Reeves and his men. It was Sheriff Donovan and 2 deputies. Sullivan, the sheriff called, dismounting quickly. Reeves and his boys broke into the schoolhouse, tore the place apart, were gathering men to search for them. Freddie's blood ran cold. "Miss Harper, is she here?" "Good, they left a message." The sheriff hesitated, pinned to her desk with a knife, said they'd be seeing her soon. By dawn, the ranch was fortified. McCready had sent word to neighboring ranches, and men had arrived throughout the night to join the search for Reeves. Frances, though visibly shaken by the threat, insisted on assessing the damage to her schoolroom. "Those children have so little," she said when Freddie tried to dissuade her. "Their books, their slates, I need to see what can be salvaged." "Then I'm going with you," Freddie stated, brooking no argument. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building at the edge of town. Inside, the destruction was even worse than described. Books had been torn apart, desks overturned, and the small stove that heated the room in winter had been tipped over, spilling ashes across the floor. On the teacher's desk, a knife pinned a crude note with a message that made Freddie's jaw clench in fury. Frances surveyed the damage with remarkable composure, though Freddie noticed how she trembled slightly as she gathered torn pages from her students' primers. "Why would they do this?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. What possible satisfaction could come from destroying children's books? Freddie helped her write a small desk. "Men like Reeves don't need reasons. They just need targets." As they worked to restore some order to the chaos, the sheriff arrived with news. "Tracked them heading south toward the territorial border. Deputies and some volunteers are following, but they've got a good head start." "Will they come back?" Frances asked directly. The sheriff exchanged a glance with Freddie. "Hard to say, miss. Reeves isn't known for letting go of grudges, but he's wanted in 3 territories. He might decide it's smarter to keep moving." But Freddie knew better. The deliberate nature of the schoolhouse vandalism, the personal threat, Reeves wouldn't be satisfied until he'd followed through. And now the thought of Frances in danger awakened something in Freddie he had long suppressed, the fierce determination to protect what mattered to him. Because somewhere between that rainy afternoon and this moment, Frances Harper had come to matter more than his carefully constructed solitude, more than his vow to remain unattached, more than anything except her safety. The weeks that followed brought an uneasy peace. The schoolhouse was repaired with community help, and Frances resumed teaching, though Freddie or another ranch hand now accompanied her to and from school each day. The search for Reeves continued without success, and gradually, the vigilance of the first days began to relax. For Freddie, however, these weeks marked a profound internal shift. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, and he found himself unable and increasingly unwilling to rebuild them. He began joining the other hands for meals rather than eating alone, contributed to conversations around the bunkhouse stove in the evenings, and even rode into town occasionally for Saturday night gatherings. But most significantly, he sought out Frances's company whenever possible, volunteering to drive her to school, helping her carry supplies, even assisting her students with a project to build birdhouses for the schoolyard. "You have quite a way with the children," Frances remarked one afternoon as they watched the older boys carefully nail their constructions together under Freddie's guidance. "They're good kids, eager to learn." "They respect you. Little Jimmy Watson told me you're the bravest man in the territory." Freddie laughed, the sound coming easier to him these days. The imagination of youth. Frances studied him thoughtfully. I don't think it's imagination at all. You've changed since I first met you, Freddie Sullivan. Have I? You smile more, you talk more, you seem present in a way you weren't before. The observation was startlingly accurate. Freddie found himself wanting to explain the transformation, to tell her that she was its cause, that her arrival had awakened him to the emptiness of the life he had chosen. But such declarations seemed beyond his capabilities. Instead, he said simply, I've found reasons to engage with the world again. The look they shared held more meaning than either was prepared to acknowledge openly. But later that evening, as Freddie rode beside the wagon carrying Frances and her aunt back to the ranch, he allowed himself to imagine a different future than the solitary one he had planned, one with a small house filled with books and laughter, children running in a yard where birdhouses hung from trees, and Frances by his side through all the seasons of life. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a tentative hope. This newfound hope made the events of early December all the more devastating. Word reached the Rocking M that Jasper Reeves and his gang had robbed a bank in a neighboring town, killing 2 people in the process. Worse, witnesses reported hearing Reeves boast that he had unfinished business up north. He's coming back, McCready said grimly during an emergency meeting at the ranch. And this time he's got blood on his hands. The sheriff organized round-the-clock patrols in town, while McCready ensured the ranch was never left unguarded. Frances was instructed never to be alone, a restriction she accepted with reluctant understanding. I refuse to live in fear, she told Freddie as they rode to town together, but I'm not foolish enough to underestimate the danger. The weather turned bitterly cold, with heavy snow blanketing the valley. The harsh conditions provided some comfort. Surely Reeves wouldn't attempt to cross the mountain passes until spring, but also created new worries as travel between town and outlying ranches became treacherous. 3 days before Christmas, Frances insisted on returning to the schoolhouse to prepare gifts for her students, despite the heavy snow falling. It might be the last chance before the holiday, she argued when Freddie expressed concern about the weather. And I promised each child would have something to unwrap on Christmas morning. Unable to dissuade her, Freddie saddled the strongest horses and hitched them to the small sleigh used for winter travel. The journey to town was slow but uneventful. The landscape transformed into a silent white wilderness, broken only by the sound of bells on the harness and the horses' steady breathing. The town appeared deserted when they arrived, most people having chosen to remain indoors during the storm. Freddie helped Frances wade through knee-deep snow to the schoolhouse, where a fire was quickly lit to ward off the bitter cold. I won't be long, Frances promised as she set to work wrapping small gifts, candy, pencils, hand-knitted scarves she had made during evening hours. Freddie positioned himself by the window, watching the falling snow with growing concern. We should leave within the hour, this storm's getting worse. Frances nodded, her fingers moving quickly to tie ribbons around the last packages. Just a few more minutes. The sound was so faint that at first Freddie thought he had imagined it, the distant crunch of horses' hooves in snow, approaching from the south edge of town. Moving away from the window, he extinguished the lantern, plunging the room into semi-darkness lit only by the stove's glow. Freddie, what is it? Frances whispered, sensing his sudden tension. Riders, stay low and quiet. Through the frosted window, Freddie could make out 3 mounted figures moving slowly down the main street, checking buildings as they went. Even bundled against the cold, there was no mistaking Jasper Reeves' tall form in the lead. It's them, Freddie said quietly. They must have come through Baker's Pass. Frances moved to his side, peering out at the approaching danger. How did they know we would be here? They didn't. But they know the schoolhouse matters to you. As they watched, Reeves directed his companions toward different buildings, the general store, the hotel, the sheriff's office, while he himself headed directly for the schoolhouse. Is there a back door? Freddie asked urgently. Yes, but it opens onto open ground, there's no cover. Freddie quickly assessed their options. The sleigh was tethered at the front of the building, clearly visible. Even if they could reach it undetected, the sound of the bells would give them away immediately. The schoolhouse itself offered little protection, simple wooden walls that would provide no defense against determined men with guns. Frances, listen to me, Freddie said, taking her hands in his. When Reeves comes through that door, I want you to slip out the back and make for the church. Pastor Wilson lives in the adjacent building. Get inside and barricade the door. And you, what will you do? The fear in her eyes nearly undid his resolve, but Freddie forced himself to remain focused. I'll keep Reeves occupied, buy you time. No, Frances said firmly. I won't leave you to face him alone. Frances. We stay together, she insisted. If we separate, he could catch me in the open, and you would be outnumbered here. The logic of her argument was sound, but the thought of her in the line of fire made Freddie's blood run cold. Before he could formulate another plan, footsteps sounded on the schoolhouse porch, followed by the creak of the door opening. In one swift motion, Freddie pushed Frances behind the teacher's desk and positioned himself in the shadows beside the door. As Reeves stepped into the darkened schoolroom, Freddie brought the butt of his pistol down hard on the man's head. Reeves staggered but didn't fall. Spinning around with surprising agility, he tackled Freddie before he could fire, sending both men crashing into desks. The gun skittered across the floor, out of reach. Sullivan, Reeves spat, recognizing him despite the dim light, should have known MacCready's watchdog would be here. They struggled in the confined space, evenly matched in strength, but with Reeves having the advantage of ruthlessness. When Reeves managed to draw a knife from his boot, Freddie caught his wrist, the blade hovering inches from his throat. Where's the pretty teacher? Reeves growled, pressing his weight behind the blade. Got plans for her after I finish with you. The taunt gave Freddie a surge of desperate strength. Twisting sideways, he slammed Reeves' arm against a desk edge, forcing him to drop the knife. The reprieve was temporary. Reeves immediately reached for the gun holstered at his hip. The shot that rang out froze both men. Frances stood by her desk, Freddie's fallen pistol steady in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Above them, a new hole in the schoolhouse roof admitted a swirl of snowflakes. The next one won't miss, Mr. Reeves, she said, her voice remarkably calm. Please step away from Mr. Sullivan. Reeves' face contorted with rage, but he slowly raised his hands and backed away. Freddie scrambled to his feet, quickly retrieving Reeves' weapons. His men will have heard the shot, Freddie warned, binding Reeves' hands with a length of rope from a shelf. Then we need to move quickly, Frances replied, already gathering her coat. The sheriff's office. Freddie nodded, stay behind me, and Frances, that was a remarkable shot. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. My father believed every woman should know how to handle a firearm. With Reeves securely bound and at gunpoint, they made their way cautiously into the snow-filled street. The shot had indeed alerted Reeves' companions, who were now converging on the schoolhouse from different directions. There, one of them shouted, spotting the trio emerging from the building. What followed was a desperate dash through deep snow toward the sheriff's office, with bullets cutting through the falling flakes around them. Freddie pushed Reeves ahead while keeping Frances sheltered behind his body as much as possible. They had almost reached their destination when Freddie felt the impact, a searing pain in his left shoulder that spun him half around. Gritting his teeth against the shock, he forced himself to keep moving, aware that stopping meant death for both him and Frances. They burst through the sheriff's door to find Deputy Clark already alert to the gunfire, rifle in hand. Within moments, Reeves was secured in a cell, and Clark was returning fire through the windows at the remaining outlaws. Freddie, you're hurt, Frances gasped, noticing the spreading stain on his coat for the first time. It's nothing, he managed, though the room had begun to tilt strangely around him. Sit down before you fall down, she commanded, helping him to a chair and quickly removing his coat to examine the wound. The bullet went through clean. We need to stop the bleeding. As Frances tended to him with torn strips from her petticoat, the gunfire outside intensified. Clark had been joined by townspeople alerted by the commotion. Within 20 minutes, one of Reeves' men was dead in the street and the other captured. The danger had passed, but for Freddie, a different battle was beginning. Despite Frances's best efforts, the wound continued to bleed heavily, and fever set in rapidly. By nightfall, he was delirious, his body burning with infection as the town doctor worked to clean and dress the injury. Will he survive? Frances asked directly, refusing to leave Freddie's side despite the doctor's suggestions that she rest. Dr. Brennan's expression was grave. The bullet didn't hit anything vital, but the cold and exertion worsened the blood loss. The next 24 hours will tell. Through the long night, Frances remained vigilant, bathing Freddie's face with cool water as he tossed in feverish dreams, sometimes calling out names she didn't recognize, sometimes speaking directly to her without recognizing her presence. Can't lose you, he murmured during one lucid moment, his eyes briefly focusing on her face. Not when I've just found you. You won't lose me, she promised, her voice breaking, but you must fight Freddie. Fight to stay. As dawn broke over the snow-covered town, Freddie's fever finally broke. The relief that flooded through Frances was so intense that she wept silently, her head bowed over their clasped hands. Recovery was slow. The storm had cut off access to the ranch, so Frances and Freddie remained in town, she taking a room at the hotel while he convalesced in a room above the doctor's office. Each day she divided her time between preparing the delayed Christmas celebration for her students and sitting with Freddie, reading to him, telling him stories of her childhood, or simply keeping him company as he regained his strength. On Christmas Eve, with Freddie finally strong enough to sit up comfortably, Frances brought him a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. It isn't much, she said, suddenly shy. But I wanted you to have something to unwrap tomorrow morning. Freddie accepted the gift with uncharacteristic awkwardness. I have nothing for you. Frances sat beside him on the edge of the bed. You've already given me the only gift that matters. You survived. Her simple honesty struck him deeply. With careful movements, mindful of his injured shoulder, Freddie unwrapped the package to reveal a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. I made it during the evenings before. She hesitated. Before everything happened, I hoped you might wear it when you take me to school on cold mornings. The implication that she saw him in her future, continuing the routine they had established, filled Freddie with a warmth that had nothing to do with his recovering body. Frances, he began, struggling to find words adequate to express what had been growing in his heart through these weeks. I'm not a man of education or property. I have little to offer except hard work and loyalty. But if you would consider... She placed her fingers gently against his lips. Freddie Sullivan, are you attempting to propose to me while lying in a sickbed on Christmas Eve? The hint of teasing in her voice gave him courage. I suppose I am. Rather poorly at that. Then perhaps we should continue this conversation when you're fully recovered and can properly kneel, she suggested, though her eyes shone with an emotion that needed no formal declaration. Freddie captured her hand and pressed it to his lips. I would like that very much, Miss Harper. The new year brought healing for Freddie's wound, for the community shaken by violence, and for the land itself as winter gradually loosened its grip. Jasper Reeves and his surviving companion were transported to the territorial prison. Their reign of terror finally ended. By early March, the passes had cleared enough for regular travel between town and the outlying ranches. Freddie, fully recovered except for occasional stiffness in his shoulder, resumed his duties at the Rocking M, though with a significant change. He had requested and received permission from McCready to build a small cabin on the ranch property, with plans that clearly accommodated more than a solitary cowboy. On the first truly warm day of spring, Freddie led Frances to a rise overlooking a creek that ran through McCready's land. Wildflowers were beginning to dot the newly green grass, and the mountains stood clear against a perfectly blue sky. This is where I'd like to build, Freddie explained, pointing out natural features of the landscape. The creek provides water year-round, there's good grazing for horses, and it's sheltered from the worst of the winter winds. Frances surveyed the spot with approval. It's beautiful, close enough to town for my teaching, yet private. McCready's offered me a partnership in his horse breeding operation, Freddie continued. With my own stock added in, we could build something substantial over time. Something to pass on to children someday, Frances asked softly. Freddie turned to her, taking both her hands in his. That's my hope, but only if you'll share it with me. Without hesitation, he knelt before her on the spring grass. Frances Harper, I've lived most of my adult life believing that the frontier was no place for love, that attachment only led to pain. You showed me how wrong I was. You brought light into darkness I didn't even recognize. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Frances's eyes filled with tears that caught the sunlight like diamonds. Yes, Freddie Sullivan. 1,000 times yes. As he rose to seal their commitment with a kiss, Freddie realized that his understanding of the West had been fundamentally transformed. This land that he had seen only as harsh and unforgiving had also given him the greatest gift, a love that made all the hardship worthwhile, a partnership that would weather whatever storms came their way. They were married in May, beneath an arch of spring blossoms outside the schoolhouse, where their story had reached its crisis point. The entire community gathered to celebrate, Macready beaming with satisfaction at having gained not only a niece, but a nephew through what he privately considered his most successful matchmaking. By summer, their cabin was completed, a sturdy structure with large windows that filled the rooms with light, bookshelves built by Freddie's own hands to house Frances's growing collection, and a wide porch where they often sat in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains in the same golden hues that had framed their first meeting. "I never thought I'd find this," Freddie admitted one such evening as they sat side by side, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder. "A home that's more than just shelter, a life that's full." Frances squeezed his hand. "And to think it all began with a simple dance." "And a schoolteacher who refused to leave a wounded cowboy to face his demons alone," Freddie added, pressing a kiss to her temple. As night fell over their small piece of the Montana frontier, stars appeared in a sky vast enough to hold all their dreams. The West that had once seemed only a place of solitude and survival had revealed its deeper truth. That even here, especially here, love could take root and flourish, transforming lives and the very land itself with its enduring power.